Okay, well, here is part two. Sorry about the noise, but we're at school. It's page 421 at the bottom of the first column. When Elizabeth became queen upon Mary's death, she said she hoped religion would not prevent her people from living together in peaceful unity. She did not want that to pry into people's souls or question their faith, but in 1570, Pope Pius V excommunicated her. That means that he kicked her out of the church, basically. He denied her right to the throne, and he declared her subjects owed her no allegiance. A directive or an order from the Pope's office decreed that the assassination of Queen Elizabeth would not be regarded as a sin. Now, the effect of this directive was to turn practicing, not that many interruptions today, was to turn practicing Catholics, about half of the English, most of them loyal, into potential traitors. Now, though Elizabeth had wanted to pursue a middle way of toleration, circumstances threatened to overwhelm her. She had to beware of several Catholic monarchs of Europe who wished to see a Protestant England overthrown. Philip II of Spain sent ambassadors to England to urge Catholics to rise against Elizabeth and put her cousin Mary, that'd be Mary, Queen of Scots, Mary Stuart, on the throne and restore Roman Catholicism as the national faith. The line between power, politics, and religion was becoming very thin. Missionary priests living abroad were sent into England to stir up opposition to the Queen. But the English Catholics as a body never rebelled, nor did they ever intend to. Still, missionary priests such as Edmund Campion were convicted of plotting against Elizabeth and executed. Now, in 1588, a long-threatened invasion of England by Spain was launched by Philip II. Now, he mistakenly believed that the English Catholics were waiting to welcome him. News of his armada of 130 big ships carrying 17,000 soldiers was terrifying, but the Queen did not panic. She supervised the High Command personally, meanwhile rallying popular support for the defense of the realm and sending troops to protect the coast while Sir Francis Drake's ships set out to attack the Spanish fleet. The Spanish Armada was defeated in 3 battles, its ships dispersed. When the news came of this tremendous victory, the citizens took to the streets shouting for joy. Now, the date, 1588, of the defeat of the Spanish Armada is kind of one of those Jeopardy questions, one of those dates that many educated people know. So this was a pretty big deal. The defeat of the Spanish Armada did not end Spain's aggression against England. The Jesuits in England, who were especially identified with Spain, continued to be persecuted. Now, the Jesuits were priests that were members of the Roman Catholic Society of Jesus. Richard Topcliffe, a notorious hater of Catholics, was given the authority to track down the suspects. He examined them under torture to force information about people who had sheltered them. This might remind you of the Holocaust a little bit. The treatment of them was so vicious and cruel that the victims welcomed death as a release from their agony. Can you imagine? During Elizabeth's reign, several plots to assassinate her were uncovered. Elizabeth managed to give the impression she was not frightened, but those close to her knew that she was. When one of the major plots proved to center around Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, that would be the Mary Stuart we just talked of, Elizabeth found it almost intolerable to put to death a crowned queen. And yet she ordered the use of torture on Mary's co-conspirators, and in the end, Mary was beheaded. I believe that Elizabeth kept Mary imprisoned at various castles for several years, maybe 12, 15 years. So finally she was put to death. Yet she ordered the use of torture on Mary's co-conspirators, and in the end Mary was beheaded. A song composed by William Byrd at the time suggests how ominous the news of a monarch's execution was. The noble famous queen who lost her head of late doth show that kings as well as clowns are bound to fortune's fate, and that no earthly prince can so secure his crown, but fortune with her whirling will hath power to pull them down. Now when 2 earls combined forces against her, Elizabeth's troops overcame them. The queen was so enraged she ordered that 800 of the mostly poor rebels be hanged. But she spared the lives of the wealthy leaders so that they might enrich her, either by buying their pardons or by forfeiting their lands. Elizabeth came down hard on writers who criticized her actions. This might remind you of some other governments as well. John Stubbs, a zealous Puritan, wrote a pamphlet expressing horror at the possibility the Queen might marry a French Catholic. The Queen had Stubbs and his publisher tried and convicted for seditious libel. Seditious libel is saying bad things about the government, and then you can be punished for them. How dare Stubbs say publicly she was too old to marry, and that the much younger French suitor could not possibly be in love with her? Elizabeth was merciless as she invoked the penalty for libel. With a butcher's cleaver, the executioner cut the right hands off Stubbs and his publisher, not an uncommon punishment. How did Elizabeth learn of all these plots and conspiracies? How did she know what plans Philip II of Spain was devising to invade her kingdom? Spies and secret agents. They were her eyes and ears. Crucial to the flow of information was Sir Francis Walsingham. Trained as a lawyer, he lived on the continent, on Europe, for years, mastering the languages and the ins and outs of European affairs. Upon his return home, he was asked by Sir William Cecil, the Queen's right arm, to gather information on the doings and plans of foreign government. Soon he was made Chief of England's Secret Service. He placed over 70 agents and spies in the courts of Europe, and of course he watched closely the activities of people at home suspected of disloyalty. Letters to and from them were secretly opened to nip plots in the bud. Monarchs had absolute power. Elizabeth could arrest anyone, including the topmost ranks of the nobility, and imprison them in the Tower of London, even if they had not committed any legal offense. The only thing that held her back was her fear of public opinion. It upset her when a crowd gathered at a public execution and was so disgusted by the butchery that they let out roars of disapproval. Still, like all rulers, Elizabeth said she believed that, born a sovereign princess, she enjoyed the privilege common to all kings and was exempt from human jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is legal control, and subject only to the judgment of God. Despite her blazing nervous energy, Elizabeth was often sick. Her ailments were anxiously reported and discussed, for the English believed her survival was their only guarantee of freedom from foreign invasion and civil war. Once, suffering a raging toothache for the first time, the Queen feared the pain of having an extraction. She had never had a tooth pulled and was terrified. To reassure her, an old friend, the Bishop of London, had her watch while the dental surgeon pulled out one of the bishop's own good teeth, and then she consented to have her own taken out. It was commonly believed then that kings and queens had the magical power to cure disease in their subjects. Eager to demonstrate that she too had the sacred power of royalty, Elizabeth prayed intensely before using the royal touch on people with scrofula, a nasty skin disease. Her chaplain said he watched her exquisite hands, boldly and without disgust, pressing the sores and ulcers. In one day it was reported that she healed 38 persons, but if she did not feel divinely inspired, she would not try her touch. Even in the last decade of her life, Elizabeth's energy was astonishing. She was as watchful as always over the affairs of state, though sometimes forgetful. But age made her more irritable. She sometimes shouted at her ladies and even boxed their ears. She was less able to control rival factions out for power, and became so fearful of assassins she rarely left her palace. A portrait of her done when she was approaching 60 shows her in a great white silk dress studded with aglets of black onyx, coral, and pearl. She wears 3 ropes of translucent pearls and stands on a map of England, her England. An ambassador reported that at 63 she looked old, but her figure was still beautiful and her conversation as brilliant and charming as ever. There was dancing at court every evening, a pastime she still enjoyed. When it came to displays of gallantry by eager young men, she could act a bit vain and foolish, although never letting any hopeful get out of bounds. In early 1603, Elizabeth developed a bad cold that led to a serious fever, and then she fell into a stupor for 4 days. As she lay dying, all of London became strangely silent. On March 24th, the life of a rare genius ended. The nation went into mourning. Old age came upon me as a surprise, like a frost, she once wrote.